Chapter 10. Terrain. As the sun set behind the shadow heights, the orcs of the camp began to light the fires for the night. Harguth, Zul'jin, Zoggar, the young hunter, and Grommack, a seasoned orc warrior from the Lost Tribe, gathered around one of the fires. Grommack had recently joined the tribe and had quickly become an important member of the group, his experience and knowledge of the enemy proving invaluable to their planning. Harguth and Zul'jin looked forward to hear Grommack's experiences from his many battles, as they knew that his insights would be critical for their success. The fire crackled and sparks danced into the night sky. The warmth of the flames and the companionship of their tribe helped to ease the weight of the responsibility they all carried. Grommack's stories of battles past, filled with triumphs and setbacks, helped the tribe to better understand the nature of war and the importance of being flexible and adaptable. They knew that the war ahead would not be easy, and that they would need to rely on each other if they were to emerge victorious. They were a diverse group, united by a common goal, and they were determined to see it through, no matter the cost. As they sat there, the orange and red embers of the fire casting a warm light on their faces, they knew that the journey ahead would be long and difficult, but they were ready to face it together, united in purpose and action, and with Grommack's guidance. Zul'jin said, gestured to the fire with his hands. We must take utmost care in our strategy if we are to succeed. We must heed the wisdom of our ancestors and be ever mindful of the terrain. Yes, indeed, Harguth replied, nodding. We must pay close attention to our surroundings and use the terrain to our advantage if we are to win this war. We must also remember that the outcome of any battle lies in the hands of fate. Grommack chimed in, our ancestors taught us that a wise commander uses the terrain to their advantage. I remember my grandfather telling me of a battle he fought in the Great Plains, where he used the rolling hills to hide his troops from the enemy's view until they were ready to attack. Zoggar spoke up then, wide-eyed, have you ever been to the Valley of Fire? I heard it's one of the most dangerous places in the world. It's said that no one who has gone there has ever returned. Harguth nodded sagely, I have indeed been there. The Valley of Fire is a treacherous place. Not only is it filled with danger, but it can also be difficult to navigate due to the shifting sands and hidden paths. However, if one is careful and pays attention to the terrain, they can find great success in the Valley of Fire. We must use the mountains and valleys, the forests and plains, to our advantage and make sure that we have the upper hand, Harguth said, nodding. Grommack interjected with a gruff voice, in my experience, the best way to do this is to find a high ground and take the enemy by surprise. I remember when we were fighting in the Battle of the Red Hills, we used the cliffs to our advantage, and were able to defeat the enemy without suffering any losses. Zoggar nodded in agreement and asked, what other strategies can we use? Harguth thought for a moment before responding, we can also use deception and misdirection. By leading the enemy astray, we can gain the upper hand without ever having to engage in direct combat. We can also use ambushes and flanking tactics to take the enemy off guard. It is known, accessible ground can be used to our advantage. We must take heed of the terrain if we are to succeed. Zul'jin looked around the fire and said, Grommack, do you have any stories of battles where you have seen this in action? We must remember that the terrain can be both an ally and an enemy. It is important to understand how to use it to our advantage. Grommack gestured to the fire and said, I have heard stories of battles where warriors used the ground to their advantage, like when Harguth's tribe defeated the bandits at Deadman's Pass. It is said that he who controls the high ground will always have the advantage, Harguth declared, gesturing to the mountain range behind them. We must secure the higher points and protect our lines of supply if we are to succeed. Zul'jin nodded in agreement, his eyes glinting in the firelight. Yes, we must be ever vigilant in our strategy. We must use the terrain to our advantage and guard our lines of supplies at all costs. Grommack grunted in agreement, adding his own wisdom. Our ancestors have taught us that a clever strategist can use even the smallest of advantages to gain victory. We must never underestimate the power of cunning and guile. Yes, entangling ground, Harguth nodded. We must remember the teachings of our ancestors and use it to our advantage. I recall Grommack telling us of a place he encountered on his travels. It was a great plain surrounded by a thick forest, and the terrain favored the defenders. He said that it was so hard to reoccupy, that it caused the attacking forces to become entangled in their own plans. Zul'jin grunted in agreement. We must take this into account when planning our strategy. We must also remember to use every resource available to us, including the weather if possible. Tempest has blessed us with her power before and can do so again if we ask. Yes, this is true, Harguth said. He gestured to the fire and continued, the enemy must not be underestimated. We must use our resources wisely and be prepared for any eventuality. No matter what we face, we must not be deterred. Zul'jin nodded in agreement. We must also remember the stories of our ancestors about the Battle of Redstone Pass. It was a great victory for us, but only because we were well prepared and used the terrain to our advantage. Grommack, who had been listening silently, spoke up. I remember hearing of the Battle of Redstone Pass from my grandfather. He told me that the orcs had to fight their way through the treacherous mountain passes and ravines before finally emerging victorious on the other side. Zul'jin nodded slowly. Indeed, we must be careful in our timing if we are to emerge victorious. Our ancestors have taught us that it is important to know when to strike and when to wait, lest we risk all. Harguth agreed. We should also remember the stories of Harguth the Old, my ancestor, who led his tribe to victory at the Battle of the Broken Sword. He knew to wait for the right moment before attacking, and it was this patience that allowed him to outmaneuver and defeat his foes. He gestured to Zoggar, who had been quietly listening. What do you think, Zoggar? Have you any wisdom to share? Zoggar thought for a moment before answering. I am reminded of the tale of how Harguth the Old used fog and darkness to ambush a larger force on the slopes of Mount Cranar. His plan was bold and daring, and it paid off. He glanced at the two chiefs, his expression thoughtful. Perhaps we can learn from this example and use deception and cunning to gain an advantage in this war. We must use the enemy's eagerness against them, Harguth said. If they come at us with force, we shall retreat and let them follow us, then when their army is spread thin, we will strike with full force. Zul'jin nodded in agreement, and Grommack added, it may be wise to set up ambushes along our path of retreat, so that if they pursue us, we can ambush and surprise them. The two chiefs nodded in agreement, and Zoggar asked, what about using scouts to spy on the enemy? We could use that information to plan our strategy better. Harguth and Zul'jin exchanged a look, then Zul'jin spoke. Yes, I believe that would be wise. We should dispatch some of our best hunters to scout out the enemy's movements and report back to us. That way, we can be prepared for any surprises they might have in store. We must take the high ground and occupy the passes first, Harguth said, gesturing with his hands for emphasis. We must station our warriors there and await the enemy's arrival. If we can hold them off until reinforcements arrive, we will have a better chance of success. Zul'jin nodded in agreement, adding, indeed, but we must also be prepared to defend against any surprise attacks. We must remember the words of our ancestors, the wise warrior knows that victory lies not in strength alone, but in strategy. Grommack, who had been silent up to this point, suddenly spoke up. I have heard tales of a hidden valley deep in the Shadow Heights. It is said to be a place of great power and might, where our enemies cannot reach us. If we could find it, it would give us a distinct advantage in battle. Our ancestors taught us that we must not waste our resources, Harguth said, gesturing with his hands in emphasis. If the enemy has a strong garrison, then it is best to leave them be and seek out weaker points of attack. We should use our resources wisely and focus on areas where we can gain an advantage. Zul'jin nodded in agreement. Yes, we must take great care in our strategy if we are to succeed. Grommack, do you have any wisdom to add in this regard? Grommack grunted in response and shifted forward, pointing at the fire. In battle, one must always be aware of their surroundings. In the heat of battle, one must be able to read the land and choose wisely where to engage the enemy. He paused for a moment before adding, and remember, the outcome of any battle lies in the hands of Tempest. Aye, so it is said, Harguth replied, gesturing with his hands as he spoke. We must be sure to seize the higher ground and use it to our advantage in battle. The ancients tell us that the outcome of a fight can often depend upon such strategic choices. Zul'jin nodded in agreement before turning to Grommack. What say you, Grommack? Have you any knowledge of such places we could use? Grommack thought for a moment before replying, I have heard tales of a hidden valley in the northern reaches of the Shadow Heights. It is said to be filled with ancient ruins and forgotten treasures. If we were able to reach it, it could prove a valuable asset in our war effort. We must use our wits to outsmart our enemies, Harguth said, gesturing with his hands. If they have already occupied a place, then we must not follow them but instead retreat and attempt to lure them away. Zul'jin nodded in agreement and added, "It is also wise to look for weaknesses in their defenses and exploit those opportunities when we can. We must be cunning and resourceful if we are to succeed." Grommack cleared his throat and spoke up. "When I was fighting against the Dark Mages in the Battle of Mogor's Mead Hall, I noticed that they had set up weak points in their defenses. We were able to break through and turn the tide of battle." "Yes, we must be mindful of our distance from the enemy," Harguth agreed. "We are not yet ready to face them in battle, and we must use our wits and strategy to gain an advantage." He gestured to the fire with his hand as he continued, "Our ancestors taught us that when two forces are evenly matched, it is best to stay out of direct combat and instead use subterfuge and cunning to gain the upper hand." Zoggar stirred from his silent contemplation and asked, "What kind of subterfuge should we use?" "We should look for opportunities to disrupt their supply lines and weaken their forces," Zul'jin replied. "We could send scouts to spy on their camp and find out their weaknesses, or launch surprise attacks to catch them off guard. We could also set traps and ambushes along their paths and pick off their stragglers." Zul'jin stated solemnly, gesturing to the fire with his hands. "We must take utmost care in our strategy if we are to succeed. We must heed the wisdom of our ancestors and be ever vigilant in our battle plans, for the outcome of any battle lies in the hands of fate." Harguth nodded in agreement as he stoked the fire with a long stick. "Indeed. We must pay close attention to our surroundings and use the terrain to our advantage if we are to win this war. As Grommack often tells us, the 6 principles connected with earth are: water shapes its course according to the nature of the ground. An army may be likened to water, thus, just as water retains no constant shape, so in warfare there are no constant conditions." Grommack grunted in agreement and added, "And remember, he who knows when he can fight and when he cannot will be victorious." Zoggar, who had been silent until now, spoke up. "What other ancient Orcish wisdom can you share with me?" Harguth smiled at the young hunter and said, "A wise warrior pays attention to the changing seasons, for they will affect the outcome of battles. He who can modify his tactics in relation to his opponent and thereby succeed in winning, may be called a heaven-born captain. And also, in making tactical dispositions, the highest pitch you can attain is to conceal them." "It is true," Zul'jin stated solemnly and tended the fire, "that we must take utmost care in our strategy if we are to succeed. We must heed the wisdom of our ancestors and be ever vigilant in our battle plans, for an army exposed to 6 calamities not arising from natural causes, but from faults for which the chief is responsible: flight, insubordination, collapse, ruin, disorganization, and rout." He paused for a moment, before adding, "Grommack, tell us of your experience in battle of places where you have seen these calamities come to pass and how your tribe has overcome them." Grommack shifted in his seat and stoked the fire with a stick. "I remember one battle in particular, in the Valley of Bones. Our enemies had us outnumbered 3 to 1, and were in a superior position, perched atop the hills. We were able to use the terrain to our advantage, however, and lure the enemy into a narrow defile, where we could use our superior numbers to overwhelm them. In the end, we emerged victorious, although we suffered heavy losses." He paused for a moment, before adding, "We must never forget that victory is often a matter of luck, as well as skill. We must act with wisdom and caution if we are to succeed," Harguth said, his eyes glinting in the firelight. "Our forces are no match for their numbers, but if we use our wits and make use of the terrain, we can gain an advantage." Grommack nodded in agreement. "I've seen it done before, on the fields at Zoggar's Pass. We managed to surprise the enemy and take them by surprise, even though they outnumbered us 10 to 1. Zul'jin listened intently to Grommack's tale, then looked to Harguth. "It is true that if we use our resources wisely, we can prevail against overwhelming odds. We must remember the wisdom of our ancestors, other conditions being equal. If one force is hurled against another 10 times its size, the result will be the flight of the former." Zul'jin nodded in agreement. "The wise man knows that a balance must be struck between strength and weakness, lest the army suffer. We must remember our ancestors' wisdom and strive for harmony between our forces." Harguth agreed, adding, "Our strength lies in our unity and our knowledge of our enemy's weaknesses. We must use these advantages if we are to emerge victorious in this war." He glanced over at Zoggar, who was listening intently. Grommack, what have you heard from your scouts? Grommack shifted his weight, his expression serious. My scouts report that the enemy is amassing their forces near the River of Sorrows. They plan to cross the river and march on our camp. He paused, then added, we should prepare for battle. Indeed, Harguth said, gesturing with his hands as he spoke. It is imperative that we remain level-headed and follow our chief's orders if we are to succeed in this war. We must not let our anger and resentment lead us astray, or we will face ruin. Zul'jin nodded in agreement, his eyes burning with determination. Grommack here has seen the destruction that can be caused by a lack of discipline and order on the battlefield. He has witnessed firsthand how a single mistake can be costly. Grommack grunted in agreement, recalling the destruction of his village at the hands of the Dark Mages and their undead androids. We must remember the lessons of my people, he said gruffly, and never underestimate the power of a well-crafted battle plan. It is true, Zul'jin said, that if our troops are not organized and led properly, we will not be able to make any headway against our enemies. We must be disciplined and have a clear chain of command so that our forces can work together in harmony. Harguth nodded in agreement and added, we must also remember the teachings of our ancestors, that even the weakest of warriors can be a great asset when used in the right way. Our strategy must take into account the strengths and weaknesses of our troops, and we must use them to their fullest potential. Grommack grunted in agreement as he stoked the fire. He had seen too many battles lost because of poor planning and lack of coordination. He pointed to the stars above, indicating distant lands, and said, I have fought in many battles across the land, and I can tell you that there is more to victory than just strength of arms. We must use our wits and cunning to outsmart our foes, and use the terrain to our advantage. It is true, as our ancestors have said, began Harguth. He gestured to the fire before them, his face illuminated in its light. We must use our strength and cunning to our advantage and never underestimate the enemy. We must not send a weak detachment against a powerful one, or hurl a small force into combat with a larger one. Zoggar nodded in agreement, but Grommack interjected, I have seen battles lost by those who underestimated their opponents, and I have seen battles won because of strategy. The Battle of Ironwood Ridge, for example, was won by an outnumbered force because it used the terrain to its advantage. The first calamity, Harguth said, gesturing with one hand, is to advance without any plan. This will lead to confusion and disarray in our forces, and may even be fatal. The second, Zul'jin added, nodding, is to rely on others for help without taking into account their ability or resources. This can cause delays in our plans and weaken our resolve. Grommack interjected, the third is to attack the enemy unprepared. We must always ensure that we are ready for battle before engaging the enemy. The fourth, Harguth continued, is to underestimate the enemy. We must never forget that our enemies may be more powerful than they appear. Zoggar piped up, the fifth is to neglect opportunities to take advantage of the terrain. We must always use the land and its features to our benefit if we hope to win. The sixth, Zul'jin finished, is to ignore the weather. We must be aware of the elements and use them to our advantage when possible. He paused for a moment before adding, these are the ancient Orcish wisdoms, and we must remember them if we are to succeed in this war. It is true, Zul'jin said, gesturing to the fire and the shadows beyond it. We must understand the terrain and use it to our advantage. We must also consider our enemy's strengths and weaknesses, and devise a plan that will give us the upper hand. Harguth nodded in agreement. We must also remember that victory does not come easily. It requires shrewd calculation of risks, distances and dangers. We must be wise in our tactics if we are to win this war. Grommack grunted his approval, adding, my tribe once took a mountain stronghold from the Dark Mages by waiting out their forces in a nearby cave. We waited until they had weakened and then struck when they least expected it. It is true, Zul'jin said with a grave nod and gestured to the flames of the fire, that we must put our knowledge into practice if we are to succeed. We must pay attention to our surroundings and use the terrain to our advantage. Harguth nodded in agreement. Yes, indeed. We must also remember that the outcome of any battle lies in the hands of fate. He who understands these things, and in fighting puts his knowledge into practice, will win his battles. He who knows them not, nor practices them, will surely be defeated. Grommack added his own wisdom, speaking of a time when he led an ambush on a dark mage's forces at the bridge of Black Creek. We used the darkness of the night and the swiftness of the river to our advantage. The enemy was caught off guard and we emerged victorious. Yes, Harguth said, gesturing with his hands in agreement. We must be wise and consider the consequences of our actions before we act. We must weigh the risks and rewards of any battle and make sure that our plan is sound. If it is not, then even at the chief's bidding, we cannot fight. Grommack nodded, adding, I remember a story my father used to tell me about a great battle from long ago. He said the orcs were outnumbered and outmatched, but they still managed to win by using cunning and deception. They tricked their enemies into thinking they were retreating when in fact they were just drawing them into a trap. We must be ever vigilant in our battle plans, Harguth said, gesturing to the fire as if to emphasize his point. Our ancestors taught us that a general who advances without coveting fame and retreats without fearing disgrace, whose only thought is to protect his country and do good service for his sovereign, is the jewel of the tribe. Zul'jin nodded in agreement, adding, Grommack has often spoken of how his grandfather was able to use the terrain of the Battle of Ironwood Ridge to turn the tide in favor of their forces. We should take note of these strategies and find ways to apply them to our own battles. Grommack cleared his throat and added, my grandfather also spoke of a time when the orcs of the White Sands tribe won a great victory at the Battle of the Desert Oasis. They used the terrain of the desert to their advantage and were able to surprise their enemies with a sudden attack from the rear. We must treat our soldiers like they are our children, Harguth said, gesturing with his hands in emphasis. If we love them and protect them, they will follow us into any danger and fight for us until their last breath. Zul'jin nodded in agreement and added, our ancestors were wise to remind us of this. We must always take care of our warriors and show them the respect they deserve. Grommack grunted in agreement, adding a story from his own experience. I recall when I was young and I accompanied my father to battle. He treated his soldiers as if they were his own sons, and they followed him loyally and bravely. We won that day because of his leadership. It is true, Zul'jin said, his voice low and grave. We must be firm in our leadership if we are to succeed. Our warriors must know that their actions will have consequences, for good or ill. We must not be too indulgent, lest they become spoiled and ineffective. Harguth nodded in agreement before adding, we must also be wise in our strategy, using the terrain to our advantage, like our ancestors did in the battles of old. Grommack, do you have any tales you can share with us of your experiences in war? Grommack grunted and shifted closer to the fire. He was silent for a few moments before he began speaking in a gruff voice, I remember one battle in particular. We were outnumbered and outmatched, but thanks to our cunning and shrewdness, we managed to turn the tide and emerge victorious. We used the terrain to our favor, hiding in the shadows of the trees and striking at the enemy when they least expected it. He paused to take a sip from his mead before continuing. We had to be swift and relentless in our attack, never letting up until the enemy had been defeated. It is true, said Harguth, pausing to throw more wood on the fire. The crackle of the flames and the night sounds of the forest filled the silence as he continued. We must know our enemy's strengths and weaknesses, and be prepared for any surprise attacks they may have planned. We must also be aware of the terrain and how it can be used to our advantage. He looked up at Zul'jin before adding, Grommack has informed me, for example, that there are several caves near the enemy's encampment that could be used to mount a surprise attack or gain access to their supplies. It is true, Zul'jin said with a grunt, that we must take utmost care in our strategy if we are to gain victory. We must not only be aware of the enemy's weaknesses and strengths, but also those of our own. If we know that the enemy is open to attack, but are unaware that our own men are not in a condition to attack, then we have only gone halfway towards victory. Harguth nodded in agreement as he added, we must also keep in mind that no battle plan survives contact with the enemy. We must remain flexible and adaptable to any changes that may occur during battle. He paused for a moment before adding, and we must never forget that fortune favors the bold. Grommack interjected, his voice low and gravelly, I remember when I was in the Shadow Hills, during the Great War against the Dark Mages. The terrain was treacherous and the enemy was fierce, but we won because we used the land to our advantage. We set traps and ambushes in places where the enemy least expected it and we were able to gain a decisive victory. Indeed, Harguth said, gesturing with his hands. We must remember that our success lies not only in knowing when to attack, but also in understanding the terrain and the weather of the battlefield. We must be ever vigilant and prepare for any eventuality. He glanced at Zoggar, who nodded in agreement. Grommack added gruffly, I remember when I fought in the Battle of the Marshlands. The enemy had set up camp in a marshy area near a river. We knew that attacking them there would be difficult, so we waited until a storm came in and the ground became flooded. We were then able to use the water to our advantage and take the enemy by surprise. Zul'jin nodded, his expression thoughtful. The wise warrior knows that success lies in being prepared and anticipating the enemy's moves. We must use the terrain to our advantage and never be caught off guard. Harguth nodded in agreement. Our ancestors were wise indeed. We must remember the lessons of our past if we are to succeed in this war. He paused for a moment before adding, Grommack, tell us of the battles you have seen and how our ancestors used the terrain to their advantage. Grommack grunted in acknowledgement and began to recount some of his experiences. I remember one battle in particular, he said. It was fought on a hill with a small stream running through it. Our warriors used the stream to hide themselves, and then attacked from the higher ground when the enemy least expected it. We won the battle with minimal losses. He paused for a moment before continuing, another time we were outnumbered by a large force, but we used the trees and rocks of the forest to our advantage. We ambushed them and routed them with little effort. Indeed, Harguth said, striking the fire with a stick. Sparks flew up into the night sky. We must know our enemy and ourselves if we are to be victorious. We must take note of the terrain and use it to our advantage. He paused for a moment, then added, and of course, we must always remember that the outcome of any battle lies in the hands of gods. Zoggar nodded, his eyes wide with wonder. But what of the ancient wisdom of our people? What do they say about war? Harguth smiled and looked at Zul'jin. Our ancestors have taught us many things, my young friend. They have said that one should never underestimate their opponent, and that strategy is key to victory. They also said that knowledge of both the enemy and oneself is essential, as well as knowledge of Tempest. With these three elements, our victory will not stand in doubt.